even if you want to be like a normal employee, and yes, there's some overhead, but if you're having essentially a one-person consultancy for whatever your skills are, running those types of businesses has very, very little overhead in terms of the compliance you need to do, the taxing, whatever. You're probably talking maybe a couple $100s a year. And if you have any type of regular job, like it's probably worth it. It probably helps rebalance your relationships with whoever you're working with.
Welcome to the At Depth podcast. I'm your host, Ben Rogers. I've got Alex Felman with me today. We are, as usual, going to take the time to talk about the through lines that connect what we value with how we lead businesses, build brands, make investments, and do the daily work. So we're going to connect on those beautiful through lines, and then it's going to take us deeper. That's why it's called At Depth, Alex. It's called the At Depth podcast because we're going to get down into it. Why don't you take a second here and introduce yourself? I'm excited for people to get to know you. The variety is the spice of life, and you're bringing some wonderful variety. Start with where you are in the world and then start talking about yourself.
Okay. Excited to be here. I'm based out of Riga, Latvia right now, and most people are probably not really aware of where that is, but it's northeastern Europe, one of the Baltic states.
They're Googling it.
Yeah,
they're
probably.
Googling it right now.
I don't really want to call out my family, but occasionally I have family members to this day who aren't still sure where it is. I mean, I've been here about 5-6 years now, so I'm usually very patient with people. And yeah, a little bit of my background, and I'll try to keep this short because kind of interesting enough, you said this is the intersection of many things. I wear kind of many hats, but I'm originally American from New York. I've been an expat since 2009. I would say what I'm doing now kind of really started around between 2011 and 2014 is where I kind of transitioned to what I'm doing at the moment. But at this point, I like to say I'm an entrepreneurial professional because I do a bit of everything within the ecosystem. I have an entrepreneur hat, an investor hat, and kind of a ecosystem teacher hat. I run 2 companies. One's called Exponential U. That's an education platform for family offices with the goal of helping them become multi-generationally sustainable. I'm writing a book on that at the moment, which as the date we're recording, hopefully I'll finish in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Look at this kind of spring, 2026. I have another company called Bloom. That's a media company. Historically, we've done podcasting as a service. We're doing other things now in kind of events, trainings, European Union projects. On the investment side, my family has a family office that's headquartered in New York. And on that, I'm responsible for Europe and as well as tech investments for the group. And the last bit is this kind of community and ecosystem hat where I do everything from coaching, mentorship, public speaking. I'm a guest lecturer at university. I've been an educator for like 20 years. And I feel like that's kind of the way I educate now is in kind of the more investment and entrepreneurial space. So it is kind of how I flex that muscle. And as much as it doesn't sound that way, I think all 3 parts kind of feed off each other and the sum is greater than the individual parts and even the sum of the parts. So it's a nice feeding of each other.
I found too that there are some parts of the world where you can't be overly specific. I mean, we love the concept of Henry Ford and the production line, right? Just do your little job and everyone does their little job and it creates the whole thing. And I think in our mindset here in the West, we try to over apply that. And so, Alex, I think it's okay. You're a generalist. There are places in the world for generalists, and I think you found your place.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think to a certain extent, though, because it's not quite T-shaped. It's almost more like Wolverine claw, if that makes sense. It's sort of, there's a couple things that I'm fairly deep on, but there is sort of this broad overhang that kind of connects them all to each other. I mean, I think also in a certain way, let's say each of those things almost has a different purpose. I feel like in a lot of ways, for what I do on the investment side, that's a lot of learning and a lot of understanding and figuring things out. On the building company side, it's taking what I learn and kind of putting it into practice. And then I kind of almost refine that by teaching it to others and taking what you know. You can actually refine what you know and make it better. And I often see that in a lot of ways as almost for a lot of the stuff I do on the investment and entrepreneurial side, I actually see a lot of the stuff on the community side is almost like my gym for that space. It's how I work those muscles, and it sort of gives me a kind of a low pressure way to kind of test critical thinking, problem solving. I often, find stuff that's useful for myself because of problems other people are going through, even though I might not be going through those exact same things, right? Just from helping solve their problems in a specific domain. You can kind of cross apply these things. I very much see it as kind of a 1 + 1 = 3 type of scenario, as well as the question I get asked a lot is like, you must be really tired and we only have so many hours in the day. And I find that for me, it's really easy for, let's say, a single hour to be leveraged and used in multiple outlets at the same time. And so on the surface from the outside, it looks like, oh, that sounds like 3 full-time jobs. It's like, yeah, I guess technically, but if you're able to take 1 hour and use them across 2 or 3 of them at the same time, all of a sudden you're still working a reasonable amount of hours.
I think about a due diligence process and how you can jump into a question that needs an answer, and then it becomes the root or the starting point for a lecture or a journal entry or a chapter in the book. It's like everyone must experience this problem. I've done due diligence 500 times and I experience this problem every single time. Like, let's go through the thought effort of actually trying to solve it. And then let's take that and share it with people. I mean, to me, that's sort of a tiny little example that I can think of in my own life.
And this is why I like doing a lot of the community ecosystem stuff. By documenting it, you're making it then easier for other people, right? And you're creating this more, for lack of a better term, let's call it institutional knowledge of humanity. And you can set up this sort of documents of like, hey, here's something that we can kind of contribute to the project of humanity and to kind of push humanity forward. One of the things that I really like about the current era, but I think it's also one of the big challenges for a lot of people, is I think with the current era, I think there's a high emphasis of documenting and putting things out there and spreading it. And it comes in its various forms. Some are better than others, but I think there is a big thing of like, let's make sure that this gets recorded in some capacity. And I think that's really, really good. And even with that, I think a lot of people aren't doing it. And I think there's a lot of things that people overestimate what would actually be valuable for others. And one thing that I think about a lot is that most skills are also on power laws. And for most skills, basically most people are at zero. Most people have not spent any time, energy, effort whatsoever to learn whatever skill you're thinking about. So even the most like basic thing would actually provide value to a lot of people. They don't think of it in that way. And they're often more, let's say, looking forward and up at the people who are ahead of them in those skills and not kind of backwards at the people behind them and thinking like, oh, the fact that this piece of knowledge was really helpful for me to get from where they are to where I am now, it would also probably be very helpful for them. And let me kind of pay it forward to a certain extent so that they can kind of get the benefits. And also, so you don't want to necessarily be reinventing the wheel all the time for everybody. I don't believe that's the best use of kind of humanity's ingenuity. It's good to kind of pass on those lessons, pass on that knowledge, and let the next person behind you start from a higher level so they can solve even more problems.
Let's do a little bit of that right now.
Okay.
The last conversation we had, we jumped into this idea of intimate relationships at scale. And I think those two concepts feel very opposed to one another. And I'll be perfectly honest. I spent a lot of time hating the word scale. I felt like it was overused. I felt like everyone was sort of chasing it like a white rabbit. And I think for me, when everyone pictures scale, they picture millions, billions, and thousands, huge numbers. And that's not what I'm talking about. So when I think of scale, I start listing off my friends and I'm like, who are my best friends? And like, I hold up my hand and I count the 5 of them. And then I wait 38 seconds and I'm like, oh, but then I would add so-and-so. Oh, and then I would add so-and-so. And before you know it, my 5 top friends has turned into my 10 top friends. And you can do that sort of in your personal sphere as well. It's like, oh, here are the people, kind of the top 50 people. But then let's just imagine you have their names, right? You're scrolling through their names. If you added it up, it'd probably be like 100, 150, maybe 200 people that you're like.
It tends to sort of merge onto Dunbar's number, basically.
Teach me.
So Dunbar's number is this concept that basically any human being can have somewhere between 140 and 160 stable relationships. And the idea behind this is kind of the theory or the hypothesis is that this is essentially the size that tribes were kind of historically as we grew up. So it was kind of, you were able to know every other person in your tribe. And so they believe that in essence, those are what like most stable relationships you're able to have. Is somewhere around, it's like 140 to 160. And one of the things that I think is really interesting that I actually think about, this is a little bit of a tangent, is one of the things you start to see happening is once organizations start to become greater than that number, they need to implement essentially bureaucratic processes as a way to kind of facilitate coordination issues. Because now there are members of your organization that are completely separated from other members. So they need kind of middlemen to manage the relationship. If you think about it, let's say you're friends, right? If we have a one-on-one relationship, there's kind of mutual accountability and mutual responsibility. So we can kind of keep each other in check. But if there are people in between us, it's hard for us to keep each other in check because we're not actually like interacting with each other. And so if you have an organization kind of larger than the ability to have these stable relationships, you essentially need to create kind of artificial rules and processes to manage the fact that there's going to be unstable relationships within the group. That's one of the reasons why, at least I feel, that most people, when they're in a lot of these situations, it feels very unnatural to them. On a fundamental level, like unhuman, is you're sort of trying to force human beings to interact in a way that's like not based into their humanity and in sort of these bureaucratic systems as a way to sort of deal with coordination problems because you're above Dunbar's number. If you notice, I think a lot of people kind of rebel against that. It feels very unnatural for many people. Think of something like office space and stuff like that against pushing back against the corporate environment, or you see it again in governments and all these things where we have to build it up. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting is I think we have to build these bureaucracies to deal with coordination problems because we're above Dunbar's number and we don't have these kind of one-on-one relationships.
This is a total at-depth conversation, by the way. let's just say that there's a real psychological limit to the number of relationships we can hold in our brains with meaning and connection and whatnot. And I think if I were to be perfectly honest, 150 is plenty.
It's a lot.
You can get a lot done with 150 people. I mean, have you ever watched the video of the village lifting the house somewhere? I think it's in the Philippines. They pick up the house. The entire village is together. It's about 150 people, and someone's house is in a floodplain, and they literally just grab the thing. The entire community does, pick it up, and they move it like 200 yards away from the floodplain.
Oh, wow.
It's a beautiful image. I think it's an impactful image. Let's talk about that, because I also hear that number and I think to myself, like a little bead of sweat just starts dripping down my forehead right here. Like, 150 people. Okay. How am I going to keep that level of intimacy with 150 people, considering that a tiny percentage of them live within proximity to me personally? So the rest of them are spread out all over the country, all over the world. We can't all get around the fire. We can sometimes in a year, maybe, but that's important. So maybe let's just name that. Like, number one, if you can invite your 150 people to gather around a fire pit once a year, like, good on you. There's probably some real value there. But barring that, how do you do this? Like, how can we engage with those people and maintain that level of meaningful relationship? Because that's a really powerful thing. A group of 150 people can get things done.
I find podcasts have the potential and are extremely powerful. And I think one of the things that it allows you to do is essentially create, in essence, like parasocial relationships. But I think also for like what you're talking about, I think it can also maintain relationships that are there. But let's say right now, Ben, for you, how many episodes of At Depth have you done?
Oh, this will be number 9.
Okay, so you've done roughly 4 to 5 hours of At Depth. Let's say 5, just for argument's sake. Anyone who's listened to all of that will have essentially spent 5 hours with you. And that's why I like podcasts, because let's say something like this is maybe not a perfect representation, but a terrible representation of, let's say, what it might be like at a dinner party. Like if me and you were sitting next to each other at a dinner party, we might have a conversation fairly close to the conversation we're having now. It might not be exact, and so what? We're a little bit intentional with some of the topics, but you could reasonably think that this could be a dinner party conversation. So now imagine just for a second, right? Is you have essentially 5 hours of dinner party conversations recorded and broadcast to the world, that anyone who comes and listens to that, basically it's almost as if they spent 5 hours at a dinner party with you. Like if we're talking about the really close relationships, not to say that this should replace that, but if we're talking about like maintenance and having someone stay up to date with kind of what's going on in your world, I think doing things like this, or let's say maybe through having a newsletter or writing or whatever, not necessarily passively engage with you, but almost engage on demand, in the sense of they can engage with you at their own discretion and at their own viewpoint. Because I think that becomes one of the biggest challenges, is that I know there's probably people that I want to see semi-frequently, and realistically I probably see them a couple times a year at most.
It's the reality.
Unless they're like in my city, and even people who are in my city might want to see each other, and it ends up being maybe once a quarter, every other month, something like that. Is just with life, that's just how it works, right? And so the question becomes, how do you kind of keep it up while you're not seeing each other? I feel like this is a decent point to bring this up. Maybe do some new stuff for you, but I think it's quite interesting, and it becomes harder to make friends as we age. And so some of the studies out there were essentially, and I had to look this up, there was research done by this guy, Jeffrey Hall, and what he basically said is, in essence, friendship is a function of time spent together. And what he found more or less is that to get kind of casual friendship, it takes about 40 to 60 hours. To become like a regular friend, it takes 90 hours. And to become like a close friend, it takes like 200 hours. And I think the thing that's really, really interesting, and like why it becomes a challenge as we age, arguably, if you think about it through, let's say, school and college and university, it's kind of relatively easy for us to like kind of hit those timelines with people, right? We're spending 8 hours a day with them. Up to university, we're spending 8 hours a day. In university, you might spend 24 hours with someone. You might spend an entire weekend with someone, right? You might spend an easy 48, 72 hours in a weekend with someone, right?
Yes.
And I imagine, right, some of the people on your list are people that that's what sparked your friendship.
Yes.
And if you think about it, right, after you get kind of more into the world, how many people are you doing that from scratch with? You're actually like, hey, we're spending like an entire proper day. Casual would be what? You'd have to spend 2 full days together, like in a row, 24 hours. Become like a regular friend, you would need week and a half to 2 weeks to become like a really close friend. Who is that's new in your life? Outside of maybe like your spouse, whoever you're significantly dating, your kids, outside of those, who are you introducing into your life that you're spending that much time with? It's really rare. And that's the thing, is I think these methods might be able to like help you do that and build it up and so on and so forth, to just get it above the hump. Think of it this way, right? The friendship almost becomes a bond, right? And the more time you spend with each other, assuming you enjoy the time spent, that bond gets closer and closer and closer and closer, becomes stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And then you can't like speed run it, right? Or you can't sort of shortcut spending that much time with another individual. It just doesn't work that way.
There is an interesting flip side of this conversation that I'd love to explore a little bit further, which is this idea that as a media consumer, which we all are in modernity, right? I am a media consumer to some degree. If you walk it through an airport, you're consuming some kind of media, whether you choose to or not. As I think about it, and I think about the way that I consume media or try to sort of dial that back, I am setting all of these things out on the table. But I think about how many times a friend sends me something they've done and written, recorded, video. I've got one friend who's a musician. He did an album. And if I were to really engage myself and say, like, I'm a person who values meaningful relationship, then what I would do is I would say, I'm going to take my, what I would call marketed media and slice a little bit of that out of my life because I want to make room for a meaningful relationship. And then I am going to spend my time engaging in media from a friend because that's someone whose relationship I need to build time with them because I want to build that relationship and strengthen it. So I'm going to go invest my time. And this is so fascinating because my wife and I have been talking about this. How do you budget your attention? Like, I don't know how many VC conferences I've been in the past year where they talk about the attention economy and how much money is going to capturing your attention and the science and technology used to just grab you. I feel that in my brain. I can literally, some days I feel my brain like being torn apart by this. That's what $1 billion trying to grab all of your pieces of attention feels like inside your head. Doesn't feel good. And so we're beginning to budget our attention. And that's a fascinating little exercise. And I almost want to go at the end of this podcast, and maybe someone else wants to too, and just like really quickly have a 30-second think on this, maybe a 2-minute think. If you're crazy, maybe you have yourself a 10-minute think on this idea and look at where you spend your attention. Understand that it is an economically valued component of who you are as a consumer, and people want to own that part of your attention, but you own it. There's a great book that's written by George Clayson. It's called The Richest Man in Babylon. And the first chapter, you know this book?
Yeah.
The first chapter ends with a part of all you earn is yours to keep. And I'm sitting here reflecting, saying, okay, like my attention is mine. And I want to decide who I give that attention to. And it doesn't have to be amazing. If my brother-in-law writes a little article or something, it doesn't have to be Pulitzer Prize winning level quality work, but he's my brother-in-law and he's like one of my top 6 people that I want to invest in my life. So spend time with him.
I'm with you as well. In some of the areas that I hang out in on the side, they talk a lot about your content diet and kind of, finding the right balance. And if you want to take almost the cynical capitalist approach and mindset around this, I would argue if you're more selective with your attention, then your individual attention becomes more valuable because it's more rare. And so I would argue you should be tighter with your attention so your attention is actually valued higher. As much as I hate to say it, I do believe that we're trying to make attention so commoditized and kind of outsource and get to people pay for it. So actually go, hey, my attention is valuable, so I'm going to make you work for it and I'm going to make you pay more for it. And I'm going to demand more for it. It's really funny because I think, to your point, I don't think you actually need to do anything or almost anything, right? All you have to do is be a little bit more intentional about how you use your attention. Because if you give it away too freely, then they think it's cheap. Take more care of it, then people will see it as expensive. They'll consider it more valuable. They'll actually pay you more for it. I think the second thought that I think is interesting, and I think about this all the time, one of the things, let's say, of you watching your brother-in-law's article or this or that, it doesn't necessarily matter, is I think people don't think enough necessarily about, let's say, the emotional value of things. The emotional value of you supporting your brother-in-law and reading it and whatever is going to be way higher than half the things you're going to read. And I think if you thought of some of these things within that context of like, hey, actually, to your point, it doesn't matter the quality, whatever, just because of the relationship I have with this person, me supporting that person has such a higher value to me that no one can really take that value away from you unless you decide to kind of give it away. I think on one side, sort of the almost slot machine way that we're sort of designing a lot of things now is trying to actually use that in a negative way and realize that there's no upper limit to emotional value. How much would someone pay to spend another day with their dying child? There's no limit to that. It's an abundant resource, emotional value. And that's why I think companies are trying to kind of monetize that against us because they see that there's no upper bound. But that also means that you as an individual can get so much value from things that almost cost nothing.
It almost costs nothing. It's funny because years and years ago, I was sitting in business school watching case studies and we were just rolling through them, classic business school marketing class. I think it was like marketing 2305 or something like that. Sit with me there for a second. And here I am. It's this semicircular room. I'm there with 40 other kids. Some of them are frat boys who are falling asleep. Some are the sorority girls who are perked up and taking good notes, and then everyone else in between. The nerds, this is early 2000s, right? So like you still had these kind of classic iconic personalities in the room. So there we are, and they are just rolling company after company. There's Apple and what Apple's doing, and there's Harley Davidson and what's that doing. And, one day Facebook might actually monetize and what might that become, and Google, and you're seeing all these huge companies. And I remember walking out of that class in the hallway and started scratching my head saying, am I being forced to go work at one of these companies because I'm being trained on big business? And actually, most business is small business. And then they started looking at how these companies spend their money. And you look at that, you look at how much Harley Davidson spends on brand and marketing, and like it's bigger than their R&D budget. They're more concerned about selling their motorcycle at that time than they were about building a good motorcycle. Whereas if you go to a small company, they are all about the essence of the product or service that they're offering. And they're about team and developing something really high quality and getting customers to come back. And they spend nothing developing that brand message. And at that moment in time, I realized there might be an opportunity. It's like, if you could really help small businesses communicate their value in a clear and emotively connective way, you could do two things. One, you give them their greatest asset, which is deeply connective brand story. And then two, you are giving them a language to help their customers easily and quickly and intuitively make a yes or no decision. Like that's ultimately what they're trying to do at the big level with brand, is they're trying to make you feel what your decision should be, because that's the easiest way to make a decision. Oh, that feels right. I get that. And small companies, I feel like I look at so many small businesses and I'm like scratching my head. I'm like, I think what you do is valuable. I feel like you're stumbling over yourself trying to describe it. It's taken 25 minutes of my time. I'm totally not sure. Can I get this from you, or do I need to just go get that on Amazon? I felt like there was an opportunity there, and I've spent the past decade and a half sort of unpacking what that could look like, because I do think that that emotional value concept is huge. And I feel like it's sort of only seen from a very specific angle, from a very specific few people. And, my hope is that through our conversation, a few more people say, oh, wow, attention is valuable. Emotional response is valuable. It's not just a pure like tit for tat consumer world.
I actually had a fairly similar experience in my undergrad. I did a bachelor's degree in essentially biochemistry. And at the time,
Wow.
this is a little bit pre kind of the big kind of entrepreneurial boom. They were really, really pushing us towards either going to do research at big pharma or becoming a doctor. And they were like, those are your kind of two career paths from this.
Mm.
I came out of some of those classes feeling very much kind of similar to what you're talking about, especially when they were talking about big pharma. I got very kind of disillusioned with the space, which was kind of not exactly why I ended up leaving the US, but part of my journey of like, I need to do something else. And I started traveling the world to figure it out. And then I kind of never stopped. But I had a similar thing of they were kind of talking about bringing the commerce into keeping people healthy, and just sort of some of the misalignment of goals between these different stakeholders and whatnot. And I'm just like, this kind of conflict of interest that come up really bothered me. But a different thing on the tech side specifically, I think an interesting thing has happened since maybe 2005, 2010. I think the tech industry has swallowed up entrepreneurship so that people associate entrepreneurship with the tech industry. There was somewhat of a tech industry, let's say pre-mid 90s. But once it became, let's say, a big industry, the same way you have big pharma, big tobacco, big ag, et cetera, big agriculture, big oil, when it started to really become that, in my opinion, it's somewhere between like 95 and 2005, somewhere when it really started to kind of consolidate, mature, etc. But somehow they did this thing that like all new company creation is under this kind of big tech umbrella. To your point, I think there's a lot of harm because of those two associations. And I think actually, let's say there's a lot of entrepreneurs doing all kinds of really interesting things, some of which might become a big whatever, most of which, to your point, won't, but will be extremely successful and viable businesses and will be solving a lot of problems for whatever the people's problems are solving. I think those two things have become conflated with each other. I would almost argue probably intentionally. And I think it's actually causing almost a lot of disillusionment and cynicism from the public outside the space, but to the entire entrepreneurial field, because they're thinking of sort of all the entrepreneurial field like the big tech players, which are, in my opinion, they're really just big industry of that space now. They're not the same players. And yes, they were that, 25, 30 years ago, but they're not that today. They're kind of trying to still, in my opinion, of being kind of this upstart underdog, of being the David, even though at this point they're the Goliath.
Yeah. I think that's a profound observation. I think that's one that I hope people take to heart. I almost hear this little twinge. I heard it this morning on a coaching session, actually. There was this little twinge of maybe it was shame or something a little less insidious than shame, but like, I'm so sorry that I haven't built a huge company. And what I wanted to say is like, are you still in business? Yes. Are you cash flow positive? Yes. Have you been doing it for over 10 years? Yes. Good job. Pat on the back. Like, you have not had some huge exit or some huge sale, but that, like, when did that become the bar? And I think you just told us when and a little bit why that became the bar. And I'm so sad that people don't feel like they're successful because that narrative is so pervasive. And I want people to say, like, man, you are running a solid little business that does well and you employ 4 or 5 people. I mean, and you can provide yourself and your family and you're storing up value
And other families.
4 or 5 other families. Like, congratulations. That's called an economy. You're a part of it and you built it out of nothing. Like, that's success. Great job. The world is full of people like you.
I hope I get there. But I'm going to do a little bit of foreshadowing for myself. Once I finish my current book, I have this other idea for a book. But I have this idea for a book, I'm calling it Escape Velocity, which is centered around how rich people build wealth rocket ships to escape financial gravity. But one of the big things around this, I personally believe most people should start businesses, not necessarily for all the reasons people think, but for a business as, let's say, a vehicle or a container for helping you achieve whatever it is you want is absolutely fantastic for that. For achieving whatever you decide to be your life's goals, as a way to aggregate resources and point them in a direction, I'm not sure there's a better thing that exists than like a structure of a business. And I don't think people sort of think of it in that way of like, hey, you should have a business just so that you can like organize yourself, so that you can easily attract resources, so you can put those resources in a direction. Also because for a whole number of reasons, there's a lot of legal and regulatory advantages to doing that and running it through some kind of entity. And so I sort of just think of it as just like on the most basic level of like, hey, you should start a business, even if it's just for your own personal consultancy or as a different thing, right? I would almost argue, personal opinion, most even 9 to 5 employees should just run a business and then have the company hire their company.
Yes. Like,
Even if that's what they're doing, but just have their company hire their company. Like, I'm not even joking about that, by the way. Even if you want to be like a normal employee, and yes, there's some overhead, but if you're having essentially a one-person consultancy for whatever your skills are, running those types of businesses has very, very little overhead in terms of the compliance you need to do, the taxing, whatever. You're probably talking maybe a couple $100s a year. And if you have any type of regular job, like it's probably worth it. It probably helps rebalance your relationships with whoever you're working with. That's just a little side rant.
it's like watching my son. He's a big sandbox kid and still is to this day, but he started young and he started early. And if there was a sandbox within 100 feet, he was going to go get in it. And you could have water slides and you could have TVs going and whatnot, but like that kid was going to find the sandbox and he was going to go play in it. And I see businesses as just it's a sandbox. It's a little space that's yours. It's got nice little borders, and inside of it, there's endless opportunity for creativity. And it doesn't have to be big, and you don't need like a $100,000 sandbox. Just like set up a few boards and play inside it and see what happens. Experiment.
I think a lot of people like to do that, like if they buy property.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
They go, I have this thing that like I own because it's mine privately. And because I own it, I can kind of play with it how I want to your extent. Arguably, your own business is a cheaper version to get the same outcome. Because instead of buying either land or an apartment or whatever, which is going to cost you hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, in most places you can set up a business for what? I would say under $1,000.
Oh, easy.
And it's getting cheaper. And you could have essentially the same effect of being able to kind of play around with how you want to do things. And again, like I said before, I think it becomes this vehicle to help you decide how you want to live your life. And then it gives you a kind of an anchor point to actually actualize that.
And it pushes you to run iterations. That's what I tell a lot of people is like, and maybe this didn't come through in school clear enough, or maybe they didn't teach it, or maybe I wasn't listening. Any of the three is fair, but I almost feel like one of the core lessons of any education should be start iterating. Like the day you graduate, iterate, and start experimenting with things and work through it and like start stacking up your failures. And it's funny because the grading mechanism at school, it's not built to celebrate your failures. It's built to make you succeed. Whereas in these little sandboxes we're describing, it's like, oh, I experimented. Let's just do a quick throwback to earlier in the conversation. I experimented with my emotional availability and my attention. And I wanted to see if I could monetize my attention. And I spent a little time doing that and it didn't work, but maybe there's a part of the time that I gave to someone that was high value. Let's say I charged someone $100 to do something for them and they say, oh, this 5 minutes of what you did for me was really worth the whole $100. Mm-hmm. And then you iterate on that and you say, great, well, how do I get more of that so that maybe I can charge $300 for just that really high value piece? And everyone has something that's valuable to the world. I think that's the most incredible thing about being human is even the most boring back office quantitative person has a wonderful gift. And I feel like most of those people think, oh, I fill a role. And it's like, well, you fill a role because you have a gift. And I'm sure you have like at least 30 or 40 more, but maybe we could explore one or two more. Like go talk to that person in the back, and I guarantee they have some insane hobby in their garage that would blow your mind. It's like, oh, wow, you're an accountant for like some little local construction company. And actually in the back, you're like a master painter or something like this, or like you have incredible collection of butterflies and insects or something like that. People are dynamic. And I feel like you're right. Like that little box is a really cool space to start exploring human dynamism and drawing it out.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on a slightly different direction, but I don't know how familiar with this, but it's something that I'm kind of on the side developing to get out there in the world. Is I have this concept, which I've developed from a couple of places, called the 1% you. Somewhat stems from this Scott Adams. He wrote, it was like a blog post about how to be successful. I don't know if you've heard about this. It's sort of famous, but in essence, what he said is, if you want to be successful in anything, you have to be the top 1% of what you do. But then he broke down, there's basically two ways to be top 1%. And he said, one way is you could be the top 1% at one thing. And if you think about that, that's basically Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, the 10,000 hour rule. And Outliers is basically about that concept. And if you want to become an Olympian and blah, 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 spend 10,000 hours, you'll become top 1%. Great. The other way of doing it is be top 20% at three things and find what is the intersection of those three things. An example that I like to give around this, right, is imagine you go to a circus. Imagine the circus has a bear. Okay, kind of cool circus. Now, imagine that circus has a bear that's now riding a unicycle. Pretty cool circus. Now, imagine the circus has a bear on a unicycle juggling. Probably one of the coolest circuses you've ever seen in your life, right? Like that's a top 1% circus. And it's literally just like stacking three interesting things in a unique way. And that's what builds us up. One of the things I found, this is based on a TED Talk. I think it's called The First 20 Hours, but someone took a look at kind of learning and kind of took Malcolm Gladwell's idea and kind of flipped it on its head. Because learning these S curves, imagine a little S where you have kind of the exponential part and then it like levels off. And so he said, okay, 10,000 hours gets you to the end of the S, but you can get most of your gains on the first part of the exponential curve. How long does it take to get that, right? That was kind of this researcher's thing. And he did a study to figure out how do we get to that. And what he found is it takes you about 20 hours to get to that part of the exponential curve on any skill. Like if you do 20 hours of focused learning on any skill, you could get to that part of the exponential curve. If you can get to that part of the exponential curve, I would argue then you're probably better than 80% of the people, because all skills are power laws and most people are at zero, right? So I would personally argue if you spend the 20 hours, you probably have skills good enough that you can probably make, I'm not going to say a lot of money or whatever, but you probably are good enough that you could probably sell that as a service, is an opinion that I have. If we apply those together and sort of think about like, okay, if we take three skills that you've spent the equivalent of 20 hours of focused learning on and find the intersection of them, then you can be top 1% and successful in whatever that intersection is. I personally believe that every single person on the planet has the top 1% version of themselves. That exists. They just need to find a way to kind of nurture it. Because if you think about what essentially 20 hours is, so you can basically spend 1 week in skill 2, 1 week in skill 3, and then 1 weekend figure out how do these fit together. In 1 month, you could probably have a 1% version of yourself. And I think that's something that's kind of a side project of mine of how do I promote this? How do I get this out there? How to get more people just thinking in a way of like, hey, there's a way for me to be top 1% in the world at this specific thing that is unique and what I do. Last week, me and my wife, we went to the Latvian countryside. We went to a cabin. It was really nice. We got to meet a lot of these local people. And a lot of them had these really cool, interesting hobbies. But this one guy, he has a stone collection that I think might be the second biggest stone collection in the world in this small town, like 100 kilometers from the Russian border in Latvia. I think if I understood everything, he wasn't speaking English. I think there's one bigger one in the United States, but certainly he's like, I think the biggest in the Baltics and the biggest in Europe. And he might be the second biggest one after this one in the US. And that's his thing. He has a museum. People will pay for him to come and visit. And he's kind of known for having one of the biggest rock collections, and everyone can have something like that. I don't think there's anything necessarily stopping anyone from having something like that, except for their own mental barriers.
So you've done coaching. We both do coaching with people. And if you really think about all coaching is identifying those tripping points, right? If you wanted to kind of take your framework, there's this top 1% version of you. And on the way, there are things that will trip you from achieving that. I mean, I'll talk about it personally if you do, but what trips you up? What is the thing that gets in your way that you catch your shoelaces on, skin your knee, bump your elbow, and you're going, ah. on the way to this top 1% person, this convergence of the three things? What gets you?
It's a good question. I think one of the things for me, it essentially comes down to like focus. And I think for me, especially, we were sort of talking about this before, right? I'm somewhat of a generalist, but I'm also very much kind of a like, or maybe a different way of putting this. I don't know how familiar you are with the 5 factors test of human psychology,
Yeah, vaguely.
where it looks into your like personality. And one of them is around openness. The last time I took it, I'm like right at the edge of the top of openness. Like my openness is something like 98, 99, which basically means for me is I'm constantly pulling in tons of things, right? I'm extremely open to like everything. And so I'm constantly pulling things from all over the place. And I think what that leads to is a little bit of a difficulty to try to figure out, or not figure out, but just like keep myself like, hey, here's the things that's a 1% version of myself. And I think there is an element that high openness is part of that. But those are the things where, let's say, it's going to be the most valuable for me. It's going to be the most valuable for others. I'm going to get the highest leverage out of it, etc. And then all these other things will come into play. And it reminds me, at least I heard this from him. I don't know if you've heard this before, but Warren Buffett has a system for prioritizing things.
Bring it. We need that.
Spend some time to think about the 25 things that you want to accomplish. Write them down in a list, then rank order them in the order of importance. Ones are the most important to you. Go down to number 5 and draw a line under number 5. And then he goes, everything below that line is a distraction.
Wow.
All those things are going to be things that are interesting. You want to do it, but because of a lack of focus, it's going to kind of prevent you from getting any of them done. And so his thing is sort of cut that out, or at least I think part of the idea would be that like, hey, if you want to actually achieve these things, then you have a limited number of things you can work on at any given moment. And so be kind of ruthless in like, here's the things I'm focusing on right now, with the objective of I'm going to try to get them done, so that let's say if I get number 1 done, I can then add 6 to the list, move it up, or whatever. Maybe I reevaluate or create a system that you're kind of systematically achieving things and actually crossing things you want to do and accomplish off that list. And I think that can be kind of helpful. And that's something I think about from time to time and probably should be using more, just because of how kind of naturally out there and trying to do things and whatnot. Like that's sort of my somewhat of a default state, if that makes sense, right? My default state is to be more open, try more things, whatever, but that also can prevent and get a little bit here or there and so on and so forth.
You got a little gray in your beard. And so this is the kind of question you can ask to someone who's not a teenager.
Okay.
But what is your little alarm system in your life that helps you realize when, okay, I've been open, I'm losing focus? Like, what are the little triggers that start to alert you to say, okay, whoa, I know this about myself. Pause, readdress.
I think for one thing, for me, it starts to affect my mood. Like I start to notice, like, it's not quite depression, but it starts to go almost in that direction where I start to just not being happy with myself. There's a guy named Tim Urban. He had a blog for a really long time and he was doing these illustrations. And one of the things that he talked about was something called the dark playground as a concept, which is basically, let's say, we often reward ourselves with play after we achieve things, but sometimes you can preempt the reward by doing the play first. And then you start kind of rewarding yourself with play without actually the achievement. And he calls that the dark playground. And I would tend to find that, let's say, when I'm not sort of accomplishing things, then I start to spend more time in the dark playground, that I tend to sort of find myself more and more there. So if you put too much information into your head, but don't synthesize it and use it to produce something, then what it does is it essentially, you get sort of what I would consider mentally fat. It makes you almost like mentally foggy. It makes you mentally slow. And I think it's essentially, in my opinion, you need to like channel it into some kind of creative something so that you're actually moving almost the mental calories from just consuming into consuming plus production. Because if you just consume, they will build up and you'll essentially become mentally fat.
It's funny because you could almost translate this back to what we were talking about. Relationships do require a level of mental, emotional, physical energy. They just do. And you see those people that like just sit there and ingest. And you can, this is sort of a beautiful little part of the conversation. You could take all of that ingestion and you can give it into friendships and relationships. You can do that in this parasocial relational style, right? Like you could take all that compression and give it out to people. You could go have a beer with somebody and sit there and talk about it with them, and it feels good. You can build a little business sandbox for yourself and you could kind of explore that there, right? And then also I think too, it's pushing even forward to like, okay, I know I have a hard time finding focus. That's the thing getting in the way of me sort of reaching this 1% version of myself. What a nice place to spend some like mental caloric energy. I found like one of my things, like it'd be fun over the next 4 or 5 years to like really work hard to find like number 2 and number 3 and how they'd converge, right? Like everything we're here talking about is like this ingestion of knowledge and richness. And so that you don't become mentally fat, it's pushing those things out into everything we just talked about for the last
100%. It's funny. I think you also, when you bring it to, let's say, the relationship side, right? Because I think if you think of it of consumption versus production, This is one of the things that I will say is interesting as an American living in Europe is we are a very, very pay it forward culture. And I think more culture should be that way. And if you think about what that basically means, right, is that under these terms, we are consuming social value from our peers. We take it and then we produce it towards others. And that ends up being very, very beneficial for like everyone involved. And that's one of the things that I see as a counter in Europe is that there's not as much of this pay it forward culture. And so I think in essence, you're almost getting people who are, at least using that analogy, getting almost socially fat because most of what they're doing on the social side, at least in some of these professional worlds, is consumption. So they're essentially over consuming socially and they're not sort of repaying that forward, at least in the same way. Cause I think the States is like that on hyperdrive. That's why like Silicon Valley is just off the levels of what they're doing. And I think it's one of the reasons it's so successful, right? Is if you just keep passing that energy forward, then it kind of ends up elevating everybody. Just don't always be taking from your community and your peers and so on and so forth. Find a way to spread it. It doesn't necessarily have to be back, right? It's just to be like, hey, I got this really great thing from XYZ person. Oh, that means, I see the opportunity to do something in a similar way for someone else and just sort of do it. Kind of have this pass through you and be a conduit. I think one of the interesting things about this, at least a capitalist system, right? A capitalist system works when everything is flowing around, where money acts as kind of almost like electricity through wires or water through piping. And it only runs into problems when the pipes get blocked and then when it's not circulating. And then when someone's kind of holding onto it and becomes sort of a choke point, that's when you start to have problems and then it kind of trickles out through the entire economy or networks, right? And so I think the goal should be essentially to be kind of a node of clearing things through and then almost being like a conduit for this and understanding that I think it's almost Buddhist in this way, right? Of on the whole, you don't really own this. It's not really yours. Many things, especially like information, isn't really yours. And you're just sort of a medium to pass that to people that thought it should come to you and you to the people who you think need it next. And as long as that can keep going, then it kind of spreads around to everybody.
I did a podcast with a good friend of mine. I was a guest on his show. The podcast is called Vocal Lab with Jason Catron. And in that conversation, we touched on something that a really wise person and a great leader that I really admire, she had said, which was she just doesn't understand business competition. She said, why would we compete? Why wouldn't we all get together and just help each other? And then what we're going to have is like a hyper innovative, iterative, dynamic environment. And then it's all going to work better for everybody. I mean, it's granted, at some level, that could form a monopoly, but we have a lot of monopolies because some of them are really changing the world for the better. And I love this idea of like bringing that down to really small businesses and just sort of getting out of the competitive mindset and saying like, great, I'm going to pay it forward. I'm going to pay it forward to you. I'm going to pay it forward to you too. I want to help you. Like that could maybe be our client. Happy if it's your client. You'll bring me a client one day. Like, yeah, let's move forward together. And it was a beautiful how it works and what it looks like on people. And she's just like, it's just honestly, everyone gets happier. And it's amazing what happens when everyone's helping each other, then everyone's happier. That starts a flywheel of an attitude, and the attitude sort of increases everything functional, like productivity and efficiency, et cetera.
No, absolutely. And looping back a previous thing of synthesizing stuff is that I think the reason why a lot of people don't do this is very much kind of a scarcity mindset. But I think coming back to what we were talking about before, one of the things that helps me to like avoid a scarcity mindset, because I think that's what really makes people competitive with each other. If you think in an abundance mindset of like, hey, there's enough to go around for everyone and actually we're increasing the amount of value all the time, then it doesn't even matter if we're competing. For me, what kind of, let's say, hammered this home was this concept of there's essentially no limits to emotional value. And so if we start to think about like, hey, if what we're trying to do is drive emotional value, then there's room for all of us, because I would argue emotional value is infinite. Literally is no limits to emotional value. I think the number of different types of emotional value is different. Is like almost infinite. I think about this fairly frequent. I recommend it to almost everyone. There's a really great TED talk from Malcolm Gladwell called On Spaghetti Sauce. It's really, really great. And it talks about the spaghetti sauce company wanted to create the perfect spaghetti sauce. They decided to we're going to research and try to figure out what the perfect spaghetti sauce is. The end result is what they realize is there's no actual perfect spaghetti sauce. There's essentially perfect spaghetti sauces. And there's essentially clusters of people who like spaghetti sauces in a specific way. And I think they basically broke it down, at least in spaghetti sauces, as like, I think it was thin, chunky, and spicy. Something like that. I think you can basically play that game with almost everything that's out there. And if you start to think on like an emotional value level, it's sort of like, okay, in whatever area you're in, there's probably a handful of emotional things that people can connect to in that space, which means that there are a whole bunch of different players that can win. And all they have to do is just pick a different one. They can be successful just because they are the spicy version of it, or the thin version of it, or the chunky version, whatever the appropriate thing about it is. And once you start to think that way, you go, oh, for almost every product or service, there's so many multiple versions. And depending on kind of your philosophy and theory, you'd almost argue that those are different products. The spicy version, chunky version are actually different things. They kind of serve different needs. There's almost an unlimited number of needs with an unlimited number of emotional value attached to them. And if that's the case, then so what about competition? It just sort of go find another one.
Stop competing over thin, go make chunky.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, Alex. This has been a lot of fun. We've unpacked some really cool things here, and I hope everyone can hear too. It was a very linear conversation in many ways. And that's what I like, is when you can draw those through lines that connect. Yeah, a lot of different aspects of who we are as people. And Alex gave some tremendous advice. I would applaud him and say,
Thank you.
He's got quite the repertoire. If you didn't pick that up, I'm just making sure you're picking it up now. He's got a wonderful bank and a library in his mind of great thinking, of solid ideology. Alex, if someone wanted to connect with you, what would they have to do to find you in this world other than travel a lot?
Outside of law, pretty easy to get me on LinkedIn, which is what it's Alex Felman. So AlexFelman, alex@exponentialu.com. That's exponential-u. Pretty soon, hopefully by the time that this is up and running, I'll have the exponentialfamilyoffice.com for my book up and running. Those are probably the 3 biggest ways. I'm not a big kind of Insta, Twitter, but I would say LinkedIn, email, then I'll have my book up and running. So find me there.
I think the book's going to be a lot of fun. And everyone, it was fun to kind of dive into. One of the parts of the conversation I really enjoyed was just, I love the idea of this convergence of being top 20% at 3 different things and meeting them together to be that 1% sort of expert version of you. And the fact that that could be chunky spaghetti sauce or spicy spaghetti sauce. And there's someone who will really, really, really appreciate that. There is a market for you. Getting there is always a bit of a challenge. And we spent a wonderful chunk of the conversation just sort of playing with this idea of where you trip. And I will say a lot of people are on this journey. I would say for me, like, am I a top 1% person? No. Do I have some good ingredients to start playing with? Yes. And I would say it's really fun to sit down. And so if any of you are in that same boat, just shoot me an email. Ben@pivotal.com, PIVOTOL. And if you want to talk about this concept, great. If you want to go talk with Alex about this concept, great. This is something we talked about in another conversation. The two of us like walking these journeys with people and with companies. And this is a common problem. It's hard to find the goal. It's hard to sort of find the recipes to meet the goal. And it's really, really hard to not trip over yourself on the way and not lose hope, right? Like trip, fall, skin your knee. It's okay. You're still working towards being that person. It's all right. This is just not your thing. I think right there, you gave the podcast its name. This is the At Depth podcast, and I think that is a beautiful way to cap it off. I just want to say thanks to Alex Felman for your time and your wisdom and bringing some wonderful creativity and thoughtfulness to this conversation. It's been a lot of fun. Go check him out. He gave you the resources. Send him an email. Go to his website. When this podcast drops, his book will be out. Go enjoy reading his book. We'll put that in the show notes and link to it. And then always, you can follow up with me if you've got these conversations. You don't have to just sit there and think about it in your own head. Please shoot me an email. I'd love to have the conversation. This is where I'm spending my attention, is with people in this sphere, the people listening to this podcast who are stubbing their toes and working through things. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for listening. And thank you, Alex.
And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And hopefully we can do it again.
I'm already ready for the next one. Line me up.
Thanks for joining us for this intentional conversation at depth. If you enjoyed today's episode, take a moment to subscribe and follow along. You can do this at theatdepthpodcast.com. Again, that's theatdepthpodcast.com. You'll find new episodes, show notes, and more conversations with entrepreneurs who are building what really matters. Until next time, keep going deeper and keep building at depth.